The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, a forsaken town clinging to life in the harsh expanse of the western frontier. It was the summer of 1887, and the air hung thick with heat and the acrid smell of alkali dust that coated everything like a second skin. Tumbleweeds rolled lazily across the main thoroughfare, their scratching whispers the only sound competing with the occasional creak of wood from the weathered buildings that lined the street. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where civilization had barely taken root, where law was more suggestion than mandate, and where men made their own rules with lead and iron. The sheriff's office stood empty more often than not, its occupant either drunk at the saloon or conveniently absent when real trouble stirred. Here, might made right, and those without protection found themselves at the mercy of those who wielded power through fear and violence. In a small adobe house at the edge of town, Sarah McKenna sat in the gathering twilight, her slender fingers clutching a worn daguerreotype of her late husband, Thomas, just 23 years old. She had already known more sorrow than many twice her age. Her auburn hair, once lustrous and carefully pinned, now hung limp around her shoulders, and her green eyes, which Thomas had compared to prairie grass after rain, were dulled by grief and growing fear. Thomas had been dead only 3 weeks, taken by a fever that burned through him like wildfire despite her desperate nursing. They had been married barely 2 years, having come west with dreams of building a life together on the frontier. Now those dreams lay as cold as Thomas in the rocky ground of the town cemetery, and Sarah found herself utterly alone in a world that showed no mercy to widows without means. The door burst open without warning, causing Sarah to start violently. Frank and Jesse McKenna, Thomas's older brothers, filled the doorway with their bulk, where Thomas had been gentle and soft-spoken. His brothers were cut from rougher cloth. Frank, the elder at 35, stood well over 6 feet with shoulders broadened by years of brutal work and harder living. His face bore the permanent sneer of a man who took pleasure in others' misfortune. Jesse, 2 years younger, possessed the same cruel features, but added to them a calculating coldness that made him, in many ways, the more dangerous of the two. "Still mooning over that picture, girl?" Frank's voice was gravel and whiskey, harsh in the quiet room. "Time you faced facts. Tommy's gone, and you got no claim to nothing here." Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully set down the photograph. "This is my home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas built it for us. Thomas is dead." Jesse cut in, his pale eyes roving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "And everything he had reverts to family. That's us, in case you're too addled with grief to figure it." The brothers had arrived in Cedar Ridge the day after Thomas's funeral, claiming rights to everything as his only living relatives. The law, such as it existed in these parts, was murky on the matter of inheritance, and with no children and no will, Sarah found herself at their mercy. She had no family of her own to turn to. Her parents were long dead, and she had no siblings or cousins who might offer protection. "I've been thinking," Frank said, settling his bulk into Thomas's favorite chair with deliberate cruelty, "about what's to be done with you. Can't have you living here eating food and taking up space without contributing nothing." Sarah's stomach knotted with dread. She had heard the brothers talking late at night when they thought she was asleep, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Their words had filled her with a terror that kept her wakeful and trembling in her narrow bed. "There's men in this town," Jesse added, moving closer to where she sat. "Lonely men with money to spend. Frank and we figured out a way you can earn your keep." The blood drained from Sarah's face as understanding dawned. "No," she breathed. "You cannot mean 7 nights," Frank interrupted, his grin revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "We'll auction you off for 7 nights. Highest bidder gets your company. You'll bring in enough to make it worth our while keeping you around." Sarah shot to her feet, the chair clattering backward. "I'll go to the sheriff. This is against the law." Both brothers laughed, the sound like the barking of wild dogs. "Sheriff Holcomb?" Jesse shook his head mockingly. "He's already got his cut figured. 20% of whatever we make. He's a practical man. understands how business works out here. The room spun around Sarah. The very foundations of whatever safety she had imagined existed were crumbling beneath her feet. "The townspeople won't stand for it," she said desperately. "There are good people here, Christian people who look the other way like they always do." Frank stood, towering over her. "You got no money, no family, no friends with any power. You're nothing but a burden, and we're offering you a chance to be useful. You should be grateful." Sarah backed away until she hit the wall. "Thomas would never—" The slap came so fast she didn't see it, only felt the explosion of pain across her cheek and tasted blood where her teeth cut into her lip. "Thomas is feeding worms," Frank snarled. "You mention his name again, and I'll give you something real to cry about." Through the ringing in her ears, Sarah heard the brothers discussing details as if she were livestock at market. The first auction would be tomorrow night at the Broken Wheel Saloon. They expected good money. She was young, pretty enough, and fresh grief made women vulnerable in ways that certain men found appealing. As darkness settled over Cedar Ridge like a burial shroud, Sarah found herself alone again. The brothers had gone to spread word of tomorrow's entertainment, leaving her with nowhere to run and no one to turn to. She knew the desert would kill her as surely as a bullet if she tried to flee on foot, and the brothers had already made clear they would hunt her down if she tried to escape. She moved to the window and looked out at the dying light painting the desert in shades of blood and shadow. In the distance, she could see other homesteads scattered across the unforgiving landscape, smoke rising from chimneys where families gathered for evening meals, normal people living normal lives, while her world collapsed into a nightmare from which there seemed no waking. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A lone rider was approaching from the direction of the hills, moving with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. As he drew closer, she could make out his features in the fading light, a man perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting. His clothes marked him as a working man, dusty and patched but clean. He rode a bay mare that had seen better days but was well cared for. The man slowed as he passed the house, and for a moment his eyes met Sarah's through the window. Something passed between them in that brief connection. She saw her own pain reflected in his gaze, along with something else. Anger, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who had known suffering. Then he touched the brim of his worn hat in a gesture of respect and continued toward town, leaving Sarah to wonder if she had imagined the moment. Night fell properly then, bringing with it all the fears that darkness held. Sarah lit a candle with shaking hands and prepared for the longest night of her life. Tomorrow, she would be paraded before the leering crowds of Cedar Ridge like an animal at auction. Her dignity, her very humanity, would be stripped away by men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. She thought of Thomas, of the promises they had made to each other, of the children they had hoped to raise in this hard land. All of it was gone now, scattered like dust on the desert wind. She was 23 years old, and her life as she knew it was over. Through her tears, she whispered a prayer to a God who seemed very far away from Cedar Ridge. She prayed for deliverance, for justice, for the simple mercy of death before dishonor. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, a coyote howled its lonesome song to an indifferent moon. The first night of her ordeal had begun, and 7 more stretched before her like an eternity of degradation. Sarah McKenna, widow of Thomas, prepared to face a fate that would test the very limits of human endurance. In a land where the strong preyed upon the weak and law was nothing but a word, she would discover whether the human spirit could survive when everything else had been stripped away. The candle flickered in a sudden draft, and, in its dancing light, Sarah thought again of the stranger who had passed by her window. There had been something in his eyes, something that spoke of understanding and perhaps, though she dared not hope, redemption. But hope was a luxury she could no longer afford, and tomorrow would come regardless of her prayers or wishes. Cedar Ridge settled into its nightly routine of drunken shouts and gunshots, of saloon music and the laughter of those who had nothing to fear. and in her small adobe house at the edge of civilization, Sarah McKenna began her descent into hell. The following days blurred together in a nightmare of humiliation and despair. Each evening, as the sun bled red across the desert horizon, Frank and Jesse McKenna would arrive at the small adobe house to collect Sarah like chattel. They would force her to wash and dress in the one good dress she still owned, a blue calico that Thomas had bought her for their first anniversary, and parade her through the dusty streets to the Broken Wheel Saloon. The first night had been the worst, or so Sarah had thought then, before learning that degradation had depth she had never imagined. The saloon had been packed with men who smelled of sweat, whiskey, and tobacco. They had jeered and called out crude suggestions as Frank pushed her onto a makeshift platform near the bar. The bidding had been fierce, with men shouting numbers that represented not just money, but pieces of her soul being sold away. Old Pete Garrison had won that first night, paying $35 for the privilege of her company. He was a widower himself, 60 years old, with hands gnarled from decades of mining, and to Sarah's bitter relief, he had wanted nothing more than someone to cook his supper and listen to stories of his late wife. She had returned to the adobe house as the sun rose, feeling hollowed out but physically unharmed. But not all the winners were so benign. The second night brought Jake Thorne, a cattle driver with rough hands and rougher intentions, though even he had shown a twisted kind of mercy when he saw her tears. The third night was worse still. Samuel Crawford, the banker, who spoke to her in cultured tones while his eyes held something cold and possessive that made her skin crawl. By the fourth day, Sarah moved through her waking hours like a ghost. The townspeople had indeed noticed what was happening, and their reactions were as varied as they were useless to her plight. The good Christian women of Cedar Ridge, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Mrs. Palmer, the blacksmith's wife, even Reverend Morrison's own spouse, would cross to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Their faces showed a mixture of pity and disgust, as if her misfortune might be contagious. "Poor thing," she heard Mrs. Henderson whisper to Mrs. Palmer outside the mercantile. "But what can we do? Those McKenna boys are dangerous men, and my Herald says it's best not to interfere in family matters." Others were less kind. Some of the younger women looked at her with barely concealed satisfaction, as if her fall from respectable widowhood to public shame somehow elevated their own positions. The men were worse. Even those who had never bid on her looked at her differently now, their gazes lingering in ways that made her want to scrub her skin raw. But there were small mercies, too. Elena Rodriguez, who ran the boarding house, would slip her food when the brothers weren't watching. Doc Hartwell had quietly tended to bruises she couldn't explain, asking no questions but leaving a bottle of laudanum where she could reach it if the pain became unbearable. And there was the stranger, the man who had ridden past her window that first night. She had seen him several times since, always at a distance. He would be at the back of the saloon during the auctions, never bidding, never drinking, just watching with those dark eyes that seemed to burn with carefully controlled rage. She learned his name was Matthew Carson, that he owned a struggling ranch in the hills, and that he kept mostly to himself. The other men gave him a wide berth, though whether from respect or wariness, she couldn't tell. The fourth night's auction was held under a sky heavy with the promise of rain that never came. The saloon was more crowded than usual, the air thick with smoke and anticipation. Frank had spread word that this would be a special night, though Sarah didn't know what that meant until she saw the dress Jessie threw at her. Red satin that had belonged to one of the saloon girls, cut low and clinging in ways that made her cheeks burn with shame. "You'll fetch a pretty penny in that." Jessie had leered, "Maybe enough that we can buy ourselves some new horses." The bidding that night was aggressive, with the new faces mixed among the regulars. Sarah stood on the platform, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, trying to disappear inside herself as numbers flew back and forth. $50, $75, $100. It was then that she noticed Matthew Carson had moved from his usual spot at the back. He stood near the bar now, his weathered hat pulled low, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. the way his hand flexed near the gun at his hip. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there that made her heart skip. Not pity, but understanding. And more than that, a promise of something she didn't dare name. The bidding ended at $120, won by a traveling merchant named Josiah Pruitt, who had the soft look of a man who enjoyed his pleasures too much. As he approached the platform, Sarah caught movement from the corner of her eye, Matthew Carson turning away, his jaw tight with what looked like self-disgust. The pattern continued through the 5th and 6th days. Each morning, Sarah would drag herself from whatever hell the night had brought, wash the shame from her skin as best she could, and try to eat something despite the constant nausea that plagued her. Her body grew thinner, her eyes more hollow. She stopped looking in mirrors, unable to bear the stranger she had become. The landscape itself seemed to mirror her despair. The usual summer rains had failed to materialize, leaving the desert more parched than ever. Dust devils danced across the barren ground like demons, and the constant wind carried grit that settled into everything. Even the hardy desert plants seemed to wilt under the relentless sun. On the evening of the 6th day, as Sarah sat by her window watching the sun die behind the mountains, she heard horses approaching. Not the heavy tread of the McKenna brothers' mounts, but something quieter. Matthew Carson appeared, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He didn't approach the house. That would have been dangerous for both of them, but he made sure she saw him as he headed toward his ranch. As he passed, something fell from the pack horse. He didn't stop to retrieve it, just continued on his way as if nothing had happened. After full dark, when she was certain the brothers were drinking at the saloon, Sarah crept outside and found what he had dropped, a small cloth bundle containing dried meat, hardtack, and a canteen of water, supplies for survival in the desert, an offering of hope, or perhaps just the tools for escape. She hid the bundle beneath a loose floorboard and returned to her vigil by the window. Tomorrow would be the 7th night, the last of her ordained humiliation. Frank and Jesse had been talking about it for days, building anticipation for what they called the grand finale. They expected the biggest crowd yet, the highest bids, a spectacular end to the week's entertainment, as if summoned by her thoughts. The brothers arrived earlier than usual. Frank was already half drunk, his face flushed and eyes bright with greed. "Tomorrow's the big day, girl," he slurred. "Jesse's got ideas about making it memorable. Maybe have multiple winners, if you catch my meaning." Sarah's stomach lurched, but she kept her face carefully blank. She had learned that showing fear only encouraged them. "Course, if tomorrow goes well enough," Jesse added, studying her with those calculating eyes. "Might be we extend the show. 7 more nights, maybe. Or maybe we just keep going until you ain't pretty enough to draw a crowd no more." The words hit her like physical blows. She had been surviving on the promise that this would end, that after 7 nights she would be done. The thought of it continuing indefinitely, of spending weeks or months or years on that platform, nearly broke what little strength she had left after they left. Sarah sat in the darkness and fingered the bundle Matthew Carson had left. She could run tonight, try to make it across the desert with the supplies he had provided. But she knew the brothers would hunt her, and if they caught her... She shuddered, remembering Frank's casual violence, Jesse's cold cruelty. No, if she was going to escape, it would have to be when they didn't expect it. After tomorrow, when they were flush with money and drunk on their success, when their guard was down. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending dust swirling through the cracks in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a screech owl called out its mournful cry. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember Thomas's face, but found it growing dim in her memory, replaced by the leering faces of the men who had bought her time. Tomorrow would be the 7th night, the worst night, if the brothers had their way. But as Sarah sat in the darkness, she thought again of Matthew Carson's eyes, of the supplies hidden beneath her floor, of the possibility, however slim, that salvation might come in unexpected forms. The good people of Cedar Ridge would gather again tomorrow night, to watch and whisper and do nothing as she was sold one more time. But perhaps just perhaps, someone would finally say, enough. Perhaps someone would find the courage that had been lacking all week. Or perhaps she would find that courage herself. 7 nights of hell had taught her things about survival she had never wanted to know. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But Sarah McKenna was not yet broken. Not yet. The 7th day dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on Cedar Ridge like a physical weight. By noon, the temperature had soared well over 100 degrees, and even the lizards sought shelter from the merciless sun. Sarah lay on her narrow bed, conserving what little strength she had left for the ordeal ahead. Her body ached from exhaustion, and her mind felt fractured, as if she were observing her own life from a great distance. The McKenna brothers arrived in the late afternoon, their mood jubilant. They had been drinking already, celebrating their profitable week before the final night had even begun. Frank counted coins at the kitchen table while Jesse paced the small room like a caged predator, his excitement palpable. $300 we've made so far, Frank announced, letting the coin slip through his fingers. And tonight should bring in twice what any other night did. I heard tell that merchant from Tucson is back in town, and there's a group of cavalry officers passing through. Sarah remained silent, having learned that words only provoked them. She rose mechanically when ordered, allowed them to inspect her appearance, submitted to Jesse's rough hands arranging her hair. The red dress from the previous night had been replaced with something worse, a white nightgown that Jesse had procured from somewhere, thin enough to be almost transparent in the lamplight. Pure as a virgin bride, Jesse mocked, stepping back to admire his handiwork. That'll drive them wild. The walk to the saloon felt longer than usual. Word had indeed spread about the grand finale, and people lined the streets to watch her pass. Some faces showed sympathy, others excitement, but most displayed that peculiar blend of shame and fascination that had become so familiar. Sarah kept her eyes forward, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The broken wheel was packed beyond capacity. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Someone had decorated the makeshift platform with paper flowers, a grotesque touch that made the whole scene even more surreal. As the brothers led her through the crowd, hands reached out to touch her, to pinch and grab, until Frank brandished his pistol and cleared a path. From her elevated position on the platform, Sarah could see the entire room. There was Sheriff Holcomb in the corner, counting his take from the previous nights. The cavalry officers Jesse had mentioned stood near the bar, their blue uniforms a sharp contrast to the rough clothing of the locals. And there, in his usual spot at the back, stood Matthew Carson. But tonight, something was different about him. Gone was the careful stillness she had observed before. He stood tense, coiled like a spring about to snap, and his hand rested openly on the handle of his gun. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and what she saw there made her heart race. Not hope exactly, but determination, resolution. "Gentlemen," Frank's voice boomed over the crowd. "Tonight marks the end of our little auction, and we aim to make it memorable. The bidding starts at $50. And the winner gets our lovely Sarah here until dawn. But that ain't all. For an extra fee, you can purchase additional privileges." The crowd roared its approval, and Sarah felt her knees weaken. She had survived 6 nights through a combination of luck and the minimal decency of some buyers. But what Frank was suggesting now went beyond anything she had endured. The bidding began fast and fierce. $50 became 100 in seconds. One of the cavalry officers, a captain with cold gray eyes, drove the price to $150. The merchant from Tucson countered with $200. Numbers flew like bullets, each one another nail in the coffin of her dignity. It was then that she noticed movement near the platform. Matthew Carson was pushing through the crowd, his face set in hard lines. Men stumbled aside, perhaps recognizing something dangerous in his bearing. He reached the edge of the platform just as the bidding hit $250. $300, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The room fell silent for a moment. all eyes turning to the struggling rancher who everyone knew didn't have that kind of money. Frank's face split into a greedy grin. Well, Carson decides to join the fun at last. You got $300? Rancher? I've got what I've got, Matthew replied evenly. And I'm making a bid. $350, the cavalry captain countered, annoyed at the interruption. $400, Matthew said without hesitation. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew Matt Carson's ranch was barely surviving, that he lived hand to mouth like so many small operators crushed between the big cattle companies and the unforgiving desert. Where would he get $400? Jesse pushed forward, his face suspicious. Let's see your money. Carson, this ain't no charity auction. Matthew reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, upending it on a nearby table. Gold coins spilled out. Not $400 worth. Sarah could see, but a substantial sum nonetheless. Maybe $200, $250 at most. That ain't $400, Frank said, his voice turning mean. You trying to welch on a bid, Carson? I've got collateral, Matthew said calmly. My ranch. The deed's in my saddlebag outside. It's worth more than $400, and you know it. The crowd stirred uneasily. A man betting his land on a woman was serious business, the kind of gesture that belonged in romance novels, not in the harsh reality of Cedar Ridge. Sarah stared at Matthew in shock, unable to comprehend why this near stranger would risk everything he had for her. Your dusty piece of hardscrabble. Jesse laughed. That ain't worth the paper the deed's printed on. Then you've got nothing to worry about, Matthew replied. Take my bid or don't, but I'm offering $400 value, and that tops anything else you've heard tonight. Frank and Jesse exchanged looks, greed warring with suspicion. The crowd began to mutter, some calling for them to take the bid, others warning against it. The cavalry captain looked ready to increase his offer when a new voice cut through the noise. The man's made a legitimate bid. Doc Hartwell stepped out of the crowd, his medical bag in hand but his bearing suddenly authoritative. I've seen the Carson ranch. It's worth $400 easy, maybe more to the right buyer. Since when do you speak up in matters like this, Doc? Jesse snarled. Since I got tired of patching up the results of your business ventures, the doctor replied steadily. The man's made his bid. Honor it or admit this whole thing's been a sham from the start. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Hands drifted toward weapons. Sarah could feel the violence brewing like a storm about to break. She looked at Matthew, trying to understand what was happening. His eyes remained fixed on the brothers, but she sensed he was aware of every man in the room, calculating odds and distances. Fine, Frank finally spat. $400 it is. Carson, you just bought yourself the most expensive night of your life. Hope she's worth losing everything for. Matthew moved to the platform and extended his hand to Sarah. She stared at it for a moment, this weathered, calloused hand that offered, what, salvation or just a different kind of servitude? But when she looked up into his face, she saw something that made her decision. Kindness. The first genuine kindness she had seen in a week. She took his hand and let him help her down from the platform. The crowd parted before them, some men looking disappointed, others relieved. As they reached the door, Jesse called out, Remember, Carson, you've got her until dawn. After that, she comes back to us. And if you're thinking of running, remember we've got your ranch now, or we'll have, once you fail to pay up. Matthew paused at the door but didn't turn. I understand the terms, he said quietly. Then, louder. But I want everyone here to understand something too. This ends tonight. No more auctions. No more of this business. Frank laughed, ugly and harsh. You don't get to make that call. Rancher, you bought one night, not her whole life. Matthew did turn then, and Sarah saw several men step back from whatever they saw in his face. We'll see about that, he said simply. Then he led her out into the night. The desert air felt clean after the fetid atmosphere of the saloon. Sarah gulped it gratefully, even as her mind reeled with questions. They walked in silence to where his horse waited. and he helped her mount before swinging up behind her. As they rode out of town, she finally found her voice. "Why?" she whispered. "Your ranch. It's everything you have." "No," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "It's just land. What they were doing to you, that's everything. That's about who we are as people, whether we're better than animals or not." Behind them, Cedar Ridge glowed with lamplight against the dark desert. Ahead lay the unknown, Matthew's ranch, the few hours until dawn, and whatever came after. Sarah didn't know if she had been saved or if this was just another chapter in her nightmare. But for the first time in 7 days, she felt something other than despair. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth, carrying them away from the town and into the vast darkness of the desert. Above them, stars began to appear, brilliant and indifferent to the human dramas playing out below. Sarah closed her eyes and leaned back against Matthew's solid presence, allowing herself this moment of peace before whatever came next. She didn't know that back in the saloon, men were already taking sides, that Doc Hartwell was speaking quietly to several others, that even some who had bid on previous nights were beginning to feel the weight of shame, that Matthew Carson's gesture had lit a spark that would soon become a flame. All she knew was that for now, for these few hours, she was riding away from hell. And sometimes, that was enough. The night air had cooled considerably as they rode toward Matthew's ranch, but the tension from the saloon seemed to follow them like smoke. Sarah could feel Matthew's steady breathing behind her, his arms secure but respectful as he guided the horse along the moonlit trail. Neither spoke for the first mile, both lost in the enormity of what had just transpired. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "They'll come for me at dawn." "No," Matthew said simply. "They won't. You don't know them, Frank and Jesse. They're cruel men. They won't let this stand. I know exactly what kind of men they are." His voice carried a hard edge. "I've known men like them all my life. They understand only one language, and if it comes to that, I'll speak it fluently." The ranch appeared before them, modest but well-kept despite its struggles. A small cabin sat against a backdrop of cottonwoods, with a barn and corral nearby. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in what little he had. Matthew helped her down from the horse, and she noticed how his hands lingered on her waist for just a moment, as if assuring himself she was real. Inside the cabin, he lit a kerosene lamp, casting warm light over the simple furnishings. Everything was clean and orderly, a narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with a few precious books. It was a bachelor's home, but one that showed care and dignity. "You must be hungry," he said, moving to the small stove. "I don't have much, but—" "Why did you do it?" Sarah interrupted, unable to contain the question burning inside her. "Your ranch. You've risked everything for a stranger." Matthew paused in his movements, his back to her. When he turned, his eyes held a pain that matched her own. "You're not a stranger. I've seen you around town with Thomas. He was a good man. We worked a cattle drive together 2 summers back. He talked about you constantly, Sarah this, Sarah that, how you could make him laugh, how you saw beauty in this hard land where most folks just see dust and struggle." Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected mention of her husband. "You knew Thomas?" "Not well, but enough. Enough to know he'd have done the same for my Mary if our situations were reversed." Matthew's voice caught slightly on the name. "Mary?" He gestured to a small daguerreotype on the shelf, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "My wife. Died 3 winters ago. Pneumonia took her while I was away trying to earn money to save this place. I wasn't even here to hold her hand at the end." The parallel sorrows hung between them, creating an unexpected bridge of understanding. Sarah moved to the photograph, studying the face of the woman who had been loved by this quiet, fierce man. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So am I. Sorry for a lot of things, but mostly sorry that I stood by for 6 nights while those animals—" He slammed his fist on the table, making her jump. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that interfering would only make things worse. But tonight, when Frank started talking about additional privileges—" His jaw clenched. No more. It ends tonight. A sudden pounding on the door shattered the moment. Matthew's hand went immediately to his gun as he moved to answer it. But instead of the McKenna brothers, Doc Hartwell stood on the threshold, accompanied by several other men from town. "Matthew," the doctor said urgently. "We need to talk. May we come in?" Matthew glanced at Sarah, who nodded nervously. The men filed in. Sarah recognized Tom Rodriguez, Elena's husband, Ben Palmer, the blacksmith, and, surprisingly, Reverend Morrison himself. "What's this about, Doc?" Matthew asked warily. "It's about what you said tonight, that this ends now." Doc Hartwell's face was grim. "You lit a fire under some consciences. Son, these men and I have been talking. What's been happening to Mrs. McKenna is a stain on this town, and we're ashamed it took your stand to make us see it." "Bit late for shame," Matthew said coldly. "Yes," Reverend Morrison agreed, his normally pompous demeanor replaced by genuine contrition. "It is, but not too late for action. The McKenna brothers are still at the saloon, drunk and boasting about how they'll take your ranch and continue their business with new vigor. They're making plans. Matthew, ugly ones." Tom Rodriguez stepped forward. "My Elena. She's been sick about this all week, crying every night, saying we're cowards for not helping. She's right, we are cowards, but maybe we can still be something else." "What are you proposing?" Matthew asked. "We stand with you," Ben Palmer said simply. The big blacksmith's hands were clenched into massive fists. "When they come, and they will come, they'll find more than just one man protecting Mrs. McKenna." Sarah felt a flutter of hope but immediately tamped it down. "There are only 6 of you. Frank and Jesse have friends. Men who've profited from what they've done." "Actually," Doc Hartwell smiled grimly, "there are quite a few more. These are just the ones we could gather quickly. Others are spreading the word. Turns out, plenty of folks have been sickened by this week's events. They just needed someone to show them it was possible to fight back." A commotion outside interrupted the discussion. Horses moving fast. Matthew immediately pushed Sarah behind him as the men spread out, hands on weapons. But the rider who burst through the door wasn't Frank or Jesse. It was Sheriff Holcomb himself, his face flushed and his badge askew. "Carson," he bellowed. "You've got some nerve." "Evening, Sheriff," Matthew said calmly. "Come to return your cut of the blood money?" Holcomb's face went purple. "You can't just upset the natural order of things. The McKenna boys have rights." "Rights?" Reverend Morrison stepped forward. And for the first time in years, he looked like a man of God rather than a comfortable townsman. "What rights? The right to sell a widow like cattle? You've perverted your office. Holcomb, you've betrayed your oath and your community." "Don't you preach at me, Reverend. This is a matter of law." "Then enforce the law," Ben Palmer boomed. "Protecting widows, not profiting from their misery." The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun, but he found himself facing 6 drawn weapons. His eyes darted around the room, calculating odds. "This is sedition," he sputtered. "I'll have you all arrested." "By whom?" Doc Hartwell asked mildly. "Your deputy quit yesterday, said he couldn't stomach it anymore, and I doubt you'll find many volunteers to arrest us for protecting a woman from slavery." Matthew stepped forward. "Here's what's going to happen. Holcomb, you're going to walk out of here and go back to town. You're going to tell the McKenna brothers that their business is finished. And if you're smart, you'll find somewhere else to be when the sun comes up." "You threatening a lawman? Carson?" "I'm giving you a chance to salvage whatever shred of honor you might have left." Matthew replied, "Take it or don't. But either way, this ends tonight." The sheriff stood there for a long moment, his face cycling through rage, calculation, and finally, something like fear. Without another word, he turned and stormed out. They heard his horse galloping away moments later. "He'll go straight to the McKennas," Tom Rodriguez said. "Yes," Matthew agreed, "which means we need to prepare. Ben, can you and Tom secure the approaches to the ranch? Doc, I need you to take Sarah somewhere safe." "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. I won't hide. I've done nothing but cower for a week. If this is to be the ending, then I'll face it standing up." Matthew looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. He nodded slowly. "All right, but you stay inside, away from the windows." The men dispersed to take positions around the ranch. Matthew checked his rifle and pistol, movements efficient and practiced. Sarah watched him prepare for what might be his last night alive, all for her sake, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "Matthew," she began, but he held up a hand. "Don't thank me," he said. "This isn't charity or pity. This is what should have happened from the beginning, what any decent man should have done. But you're the only one who did." He met her eyes then, and she saw the full weight of his own losses, his own pain. Maybe I had less to lose, or maybe I just couldn't stand to see another good person ground down by evil men. Either way, it's done now. Whatever comes next, at least we faced it with our heads high. Outside, a coyote howled, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear horses approaching. Many horses. The final confrontation was coming with the dawn, and with it, either freedom or a reckoning written in blood. Sarah moved to stand beside Matthew at the window, no longer the broken woman who had been paraded through town, but someone finding her strength in the darkest hour. "Thank you," she said simply. "Whatever happens, thank you for reminding me that there are still good men in this world." He reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. "And thank you for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for." Together, they waited for the storm to break. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, but instead of the frontal assault they expected, the hoofbeats suddenly veered away. Matthew tensed, recognizing the tactic. "They're circling," he said quietly, "looking for weak spots." Through the window, they could see mounted figures in the moonlight, at least a dozen men. The McKenna brothers had indeed brought friends. Sarah's heart sank at the odds, but Matthew seemed strangely calm. "Ben," he called out the window, "they're trying to flank us." "We see them," came the blacksmith's reply from behind the barn. Then, cutting through the night air, Frank McKenna's voice boomed out. "Carson, send out what's mine, and we'll let you keep breathing." Matthew stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "She's not property. Frank, never was. Go home and sleep off your drunk. You sanctimonious bastard." Jesse's voice now, higher and meaner than his brother's. "You think you're better than us? You're just another failure scratching at dirt, pretending it's a ranch." "Maybe so," Matthew replied evenly. "But at least I can look at myself in the mirror." The first shot came without warning, splintering wood near Matthew's head. He dove back inside as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Sarah dropped to the floor, her hands over her ears as windows shattered and bullets thudded into the walls. "Stay down," Matthew shouted, returning fire through the broken window. The battle raged for several minutes, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Sarah could hear Ben Palmer's boom of challenge, Tom Rodriguez cursing in Spanish, and above it all, the McKenna brothers shouting orders to their men. Then, as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. In the eerie silence that followed, Sarah heard something unexpected. More horses approaching. Many more. "What the hell?" Frank McKenna's voice carried confusion and the first hint of fear. A new voice rang out, strong and authoritative. "Frank McKenna, Jesse McKenna, this is Judge William Thornton of the Territorial Court. You and your men will throw down your weapons immediately." Sarah gasped. Judge Thornton was legendary in the territory, a man who brought law to lawless places. But how? Doc Hartwell's voice came from near the barn. "I sent a telegram yesterday. After what happened, told the judge everything. He rode through the night with a full marshal's detachment. You're surrounded," the judge continued. "Any man who continues fighting will hang for attempted murder. Drop your weapons now." There was chaos in the darkness, cursing, horses wheeling, some men throwing down guns while others tried to flee. Several marshals gave chase, and the sound of struggle filled the air. "Inside the house," the judge commanded. "Is Mrs. McKenna safe?" "She's here, Your Honor," Matthew called back. Unharmed. And you'd be Matthew Carson, the man who stood up when no one else would. I had help, sir. Good men from town who remembered their conscience. Minutes later, the McKenna brothers were in irons, along with 6 of their Confederates. Judge Thornton, a distinguished man with silver hair and penetrating eyes, entered the cabin. He removed his hat when he saw Sarah. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I apologize that it took us so long to arrive. What you've endured, there are no words adequate." Sarah rose on shaking legs, Matthew steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Is it truly over?" she whispered. "The criminal part, yes. The McKenna brothers will face trial for extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Given what I've heard and the evidence Doc Hartwell has collected, including signed statements from several witnesses, they'll spend many years contemplating their crimes." Sheriff Holcomb was brought in then, also in chains. He couldn't meet anyone's eyes. "As for you," the judge addressed him with disgust, "betraying your oath for profit, you'll face special charges. The territory has no room for corrupt lawmen." As dawn broke over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, the full scope of the night's events became clear. Several townspeople had ridden out with the judge, including Elena Rodriguez, who rushed to embrace Sarah, both women crying. "Forgive us," Elena sobbed. "We should have acted sooner. We were cowards." "You're here now," Sarah said softly. "That's what matters." The judge took statements from everyone, his secretary carefully recording every detail. When he came to Matthew, his expression softened. "Mr. Carson, I understand you wagered your ranch in that mock auction?" "Yes, sir. It was the only way to—" "The auction was illegal." The judge interrupted. "Therefore, any bets or wagers made are null and void. Your ranch remains yours." He paused, then added quietly, "The territory needs more men like you, Mr. Carson. Men who'll stand up for what's right, regardless of the cost." As the sun climbed higher, the marshals prepared to transport their prisoners to the territorial capital. Frank and Jesse McKenna, once so threatening, looked diminished in their chains. As they were led past, Jesse spat at Sarah's feet. "This ain't over," he snarled. "We got friends. You've got 20 years hard labor, if I'm any judge." Judge Thornton cut him off. "And I am, take them away." The crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some townspeople approached Sarah hesitantly, offering apologies, assistance, even money. She accepted their words graciously, but took nothing else. She had learned the price of charity in Cedar Ridge. Finally. Only Matthew, Sarah, and Doc Hartwell remained at the ranch. The doctor checked them both for injuries, clucking over the various cuts and bruises from the night's battle. "You'll both heal," he pronounced. "The town, though, that'll take longer. We've all got some soul-searching to do about how we let this happen." After the doctor left, Sarah and Matthew stood alone on the porch, watching the heat shimmer off the desert. The silence between them was different now, not tense, but full of possibility. "What will you do now?" Matthew asked finally. Sarah considered the question. "I don't know. I can't go back to that house. Too many memories, both good and terrible. I suppose I'll have to find work somewhere, start over. You could stay here," he said quietly, then rushed to add. I could use help with the ranch. It's honest work, and you'd have your own space. The old foreman's cabin is small but sound. You wouldn't owe me anything," he emphasized. "It would be a fair trade, work for room and board." Sarah studied his face, this man who had risked everything for her. "Why, Matthew? Really, truly why?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I've lived with regret. After Mary died, I realized all the things I should have done, should have said, the stands I should have taken. When I saw what was happening to you, I couldn't add another regret to my load, and—" He paused, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Because Thomas told me once that his Sarah had a spine of steel, that she just needed a chance to show it. He was right. Tears ran freely down Sarah's face. I don't feel strong. I feel broken. Broken things can mend, Matthew said softly. Sometimes they're stronger for it. This land breaks all of us one way or another. It's what we do after that matters. Sarah looked out at the harsh, beautiful landscape that had taken so much from both of them. The ranch was struggling. That was clear. The work would be hard, the life uncertain. But it was honest, and it was a chance to heal, to rebuild. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. We'll see what can be built from broken pieces. Matthew smiled then. The first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, showing the man he must have been before loss and hardship carved their lines. As they stood together watching the new day unfold, neither spoke of love or the future beyond tomorrow's chores. There would be time for that later, as trust grew and wounds healed. For now, it was enough that the nightmare had ended, that justice had prevailed, and that two broken souls had found in each other the possibility of wholeness. The desert wind blew soft and warm, carrying away the last echoes of the night's violence. Somewhere, a mockingbird began its morning song, note after note of pure, defiant joy. Sarah closed her eyes and listened, feeling for the first time in 7 days that she could breathe again. She was free. They both were. And tomorrow, the real work of living could begin. The morning after the confrontation dawned clear and peaceful, as if the desert itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Sarah woke in the foreman's cabin, a modest but clean single room with a bed, table, and small stove. Matthew had insisted she rest while he dealt with the damage from the night's gunfight, but she couldn't lie still. The events of the past week had left her perpetually tense, waiting for the next blow to fall. She dressed in her simple calico, the blue dress Thomas had loved, now worn and mended but still decent, and stepped outside. The ranch showed its poverty in the harsh morning light, fences that needed mending, a well requiring new rope, the barn patched with whatever materials Matthew could scavenge, yet everything was orderly, cared for with the devotion of a man who refused to let circumstances defeat him. She found Matthew by the corral, examining a bay mare's hoof. He looked up at her approach, concern creasing his features. You should be resting. I've done nothing but rest and endure for a week. Sarah replied. I need to work, to feel useful again. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Can you handle a pitchfork? The stalls need mucking, and I'm behind on everything. The work was hard, harder than anything she'd done as a shopkeeper's wife in town. But the physical labor felt cleansing, each forkful of soiled straw removed like a bad memory being cleared away. By noon, her hands were blistered and her back ached, but she felt more like herself than she had in days. They ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread in companionable silence. Matthew had a way of being present without being intrusive, of offering support without demanding gratitude. It was restful after the constant tension of the past week. I need to go to town tomorrow, he said finally. Get supplies. See about selling some cattle to make ends meet. You don't have to come if you're not ready to face people yet. Sarah's stomach tightened at the thought of Cedar Ridge, of the faces that had watched her humiliation. But running from it would only give the shame more power. I'll come, she said. I won't hide. The next morning they rode to town together. Sarah wearing a bonnet Elena Rodriguez had sent over to shield her from both sun and stares. As they entered Cedar Ridge, she felt the weight of eyes upon them. Some people looked away quickly. Others whispered behind their hands. But there were also nods of respect, tips of hats, even a few tentative smiles. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson surprised Sarah by greeting her warmly. Mrs. McKenna, how good to see you. I've set aside some fabric that might interest you. A new shipment from St. Louis. It was an olive branch, and Sarah recognized it as such. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Perhaps next time when I have funds. No rush, dear, no rush at all. While Matthew conducted his business, Sarah steeled herself for a necessary task. She walked to the sheriff's office, now temporarily headed by Deputy Marcus Webb, a young man who'd returned to duty after Holcomb's arrest. "Mrs. McKenna." He stood quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee. "How can I help you?" "I need to collect my belongings from the house," she said steadily. "My personal effects, Thomas's things." "Of course. I'll accompany you if you'd like. Make sure there's no trouble." The adobe house felt like a tomb. Dust had already begun to settle on surfaces, and the air smelled stale and abandoned. Sarah moved quickly, gathering clothes, photographs, Thomas's watch, and books, a quilt her mother had made. She paused at their bedroom, remembering happier times, then firmly closed that door on the past. As she emerged with her bundles, she found several townspeople waiting outside. Reverend Morrison stepped forward, hat in hand. "Mrs. McKenna, I've spoken with the church board. The house, Thomas built it on church land with our blessing. It's yours as long as you need it, or if you prefer to sell, we'll ensure you get fair value." Sarah was stunned. Thank you, Reverend. I'll need to think about it." "Of course. And Sarah, I'm sorry. We all are. We failed you when you needed us most. We're trying to do better," Elena Rodriguez added, stepping from the group. "Some of the women are organizing. What happened to you? It's opened our eyes to how vulnerable we all are without our men. We want to create a fund, a society to help widows and women in dire circumstances." That's a wonderful idea," Sarah managed, touched by this unexpected turn. She returned to find Matthew negotiating with a cattle buyer, his face tight with frustration. The offered price was criminally low, but with the ranch's reputation and his recent stand against the McKennas, buyers were scarce. "40 a head is robbery. Collins," Matthew was saying, "these are prime stock. Times are tough. Carson, take it or leave it." Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Collins, isn't your wife expecting her 7th, I believe?" The buyer looked surprised. "Why, yes, but I helped deliver her last baby when Doc Hartwell was away. A difficult birth, but we managed. She might need help again." Sarah's voice was pleasant, conversational. "Of course, I'll be quite busy here at the Carson Ranch. Still, for a neighbor who's been fair in his dealings." Collins shifted uncomfortably, catching her meaning. In a small town, the goodwill of a skilled midwife was valuable currency. "Well, now that I look closer, these cattle do seem healthier than I first thought. 50 a head?" 55, Matthew said, fighting a smile. "Done." As Collins left with his purchased cattle, Matthew turned to Sarah with something like awe. "That was—" "Women have their own ways of negotiating," she said simply. "Thomas used to say I could talk a miser into charity." That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The ranch's immediate financial crisis had been averted, though Sarah knew many challenges lay ahead. "You were different today," Matthew observed. "Stronger. I remembered who I was before everything." She pulled her shawl tighter. "Thomas and I, we had dreams. We were going to build something here, maybe start a school eventually. I was going to teach the children. He was going to organize the farmers." Her voice trailed off. "Dreams don't have to die with the dreamer," Matthew said quietly. Sarah looked at him. This man who'd lost his own dreams but kept working, kept hoping. "Mary was lucky to have you. I was the lucky one. Every day with her was a gift I didn't appreciate until it was gone." He paused. "But I learned something. Life's too short and too hard to face alone. We're not meant to carry our burdens in solitude." A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The sound no longer seemed mournful to Sarah, but more like a conversation across the vast spaces. "Matthew," she began hesitantly, "what are we doing? This arrangement. People will talk. Let them. They talked when they should have acted, so their opinions hold little weight with me." His jaw tightened. "But if it bothers you, if you're uncomfortable—" "No," she said quickly. "It's just, I don't want you to feel obligated. You saved me, but that doesn't mean you have to keep saving me. He turned to face her fully. Sarah, I'm not saving you. If anything, you're saving me. This ranch was dying slowly. I was dying slowly. Now. He gestured to the cleaned barn, the mended fences they'd worked on together. Now there's life here again. The truth of it hung between them. In just 2 days, the ranch had more vitality than it had shown in months. Not just from the work of 2 pairs of hands instead of 1, but from shared meals, conversation, the simple human connection that makes any burden lighter. We should be clear about expectations, Sarah said practically. I'll work for my keep, help with the cattle, maintain the house, but I won't. That is what the McKennas tried to make me. I can't. God, no, Matthew said forcefully. Never. You're here as a partner in work. Nothing more unless someday you might want something more. But that would be your choice. Freely made. Or not at all. Sarah felt a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged ease in her chest. Then we understand each other. We do. As full dark settled over the desert, they made their way to their separate quarters. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah didn't dread the night. The demons that had haunted her through the week of horror seemed held at bay by the simple presence of a good man nearby, by honest work that tired the body and eased the mind. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the night sounds, wind in the cottonwoods, a distant owl, the comforting creak of the windmill. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges. The gossips of Cedar Ridge would have their say. The ranch's struggles were far from over, but tonight she was safe. She was free, and slowly, carefully, like a plant after drought greeting the first drops of rain, she was beginning to heal. 3 weeks had passed since the night of confrontation, and life at the Carson Ranch had settled into a rhythm of hard work and quiet companionship. Sarah had grown stronger, her hands now calloused from labor, her face bronzed by the sun. She could rope a calf, mend a fence, and had even learned to shoot after Matthew insisted she needed to protect herself when he was away with the herds. On this particular morning, she was hanging laundry when she spotted a dust cloud on the horizon, multiple riders, moving fast. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the porch rail. "Matthew," she called toward the barn. He emerged quickly, assessing the situation with a practiced eye. "Get inside," he ordered, checking his Colt. "I'm staying with you," she said firmly, chambering around in the rifle. Before he could argue, the riders were upon them, but instead of attackers, they saw Deputy Webb leading a group of marshals. His face was grim as he dismounted. "Mrs. McKenna, Mr. Carson, I'm sorry to bring trouble, but we've got a problem. Frank and Jesse McKenna escaped during a prisoner transfer 2 days ago, killed a guard, took horses and guns. Word is they're heading back this way." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Matthew stepped closer to her, protective but not coddling. "How many men can you leave us?" Matthew asked. "That's just it," Webb said miserably. "Judge Thornton ordered most of the marshals to pursue them toward Mexico. He thinks they're running for the border, but I know the McKennas. They won't run without settling scores first. So we're on our own," Matthew stated flatly. "Not entirely. Some townspeople are organizing a watch. Doc Hartwell, Ben Palmer, Tom Rodriguez, the same men who stood with you before. But," Webb hesitated. "But what?" Sarah prompted. "There's been fires. The Henderson store had a mysterious blaze last night. Nothing burned bad, but the message was clear. People are scared." After Webb and his men left to continue their patrol, Matthew and Sarah stood in tense silence. The peace they'd built suddenly felt fragile as glass. "You should go to town," Matthew said finally. "Stay with Elena Rodriguez until—" "No," Sarah's voice was steel. "I won't run. I won't hide. Not again. This is different. Before, they wanted to profit from you. Now they want revenge. They'll kill you, Sarah." "They'll kill you too," she countered. "And I won't have your death on my conscience. We face this together or not at all." Matthew studied her, seeing the determination that had grown stronger each day. The broken woman who'd stood on that auction platform was gone. replaced by someone tempered by trial. "All right," he conceded. Together, they spent the day preparing. Windows were boarded, leaving slots for rifle barrels. Ammunition was distributed to strategic points. The horses were moved to a hidden canyon Matthew knew. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of blood, other defenders arrived. Ben Palmer brought his forge hammer along with his guns. "Figured if it comes to close quarters, I'll use what I know best," he said with grim humor. Doc Hartwell carried his medical bag and a shotgun. "Hoping I'll only need the first, preparing for the second." Tom Rodriguez had brought Elena despite Matthew's protests. "You think I'd leave her alone in town when those devils are loose?" Tom demanded. "Besides," Elena added, checking a pistol with surprising familiarity, "Sarah's not the only woman who can defend what's hers." Reverend Morrison arrived last, Bible in one hand, rifle in the other. "The Lord helps those who help themselves," he said to their surprised looks. "David didn't face Goliath with prayers alone." As darkness fell, they took positions around the ranch. Sarah and Elena were stationed inside the cabin with clear fields of fire from the windows. The men spread out around the perimeter, using what cover they could find. The attack came at midnight. It started with fire arrows arcing through the darkness, targeting the barn. Ben Palmer and Tom Rodriguez rushed to fight the flames while the others covered them. Then came the gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the desert like deadly stars. "There!" Sarah spotted movement near the well and fired, her shot sparking off stone. The battle was chaotic, fierce. The McKenna brothers had brought help, desperate men, outlaws with nothing to lose. But the defenders had something the attackers didn't. They were fighting for home, for principle, for each other. Sarah lost track of time in the smoke and noise. She fired, reloaded, fired again. Beside her, Elena proved surprisingly deadly with her pistol. At one point, an attacker made it to the window. Sarah swung her rifle like a club, catching him in the jaw and sending him reeling back into the darkness. Then she heard Matthew cry out. Through the gun smoke, she saw him grappling with Frank McKenna near the corral. Frank was bigger, stronger, and Matthew's rifle lay yards away in the dirt. Without thinking, Sarah burst from the cabin. She heard Elena screaming her name, heard bullets whining past. But all she could see was Matthew being driven to his knees by Frank's brutal assault. "Frank!" she shouted. The big man turned, his face a mask of hatred. Well, the merchandise comes to me." He started toward her, leaving Matthew gasping in the dirt. Sarah raised her rifle, but Frank kept coming, confident in his intimidation. "You won't shoot," he sneered. "You're too weak, too—" Sarah pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Frank McKenna staggered, looking down in shock at the spreading red stain on his chest. He took 2 more steps, then collapsed. "No!" Jesse's anguished cry came from behind the overturned wagon he'd been using for cover. He burst out, guns blazing, charging straight at Sarah. Matthew, bloodied but not beaten, rolled and came up with his pistol. His shot took Jesse in the shoulder, spinning him around. Doc Hartwell's shotgun boomed, and Jesse McKenna fell beside his brother. The remaining attackers, seeing their leaders fall, broke and ran. Ben Palmer's victory whoop echoed across the desert as the defenders gave chase briefly before letting them go. Sarah dropped her rifle and ran to Matthew, helping him sit up. His face was battered, one eye already swelling shut. But he was alive. "You saved me," he said wonderingly. "You saved me first," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "It seemed only fair to return the favor." Doc Hartwell knelt beside them, checking Matthew's injuries with practiced hands. "Nothing broken, though you'll be sore for weeks. Sarah, let me see your hands. Powder burns. Elena, bring my bag." As the doctor worked, the others gathered around. The barn was saved, though scorched. Reverend Morrison said a prayer over the McKenna brothers' bodies, not for their sake, but for the living who'd been forced to kill. "It's over," Ben Palmer said. Really over this time. Deputy Webb arrived at dawn with reinforcements. Far too late to help, but in time to take statements and remove the bodies. He seemed older, worn down by the weight of events. "The town owes you all a debt," he said. "Especially you, Mrs. McKenna. You faced down the devil himself." "We all did," Sarah corrected, looking at the faces around her. These people who'd found courage when it mattered most. As the sun rose over the mountains, Sarah and Matthew sat on the porch while Doc Hartwell finished binding Matthew's ribs. The ranch bore scars from the battle, bullet holes, scorch marks, blood in the dirt, but it stood strong. "We need to talk about something," Matthew said quietly. Sarah tensed. "If you want me to leave—" "What? No!" He turned to her, wincing at the movement. "Sarah, last night when Frank had me down, when I thought I was going to die, all I could think was that I'd never told you. That is, I've been feeling— what I mean is—" She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I know," she said softly. "I've been feeling it too, but I wasn't ready. Part of me felt like caring for someone again would betray Thomas's memory. And now—" Sarah looked out at the desert, harsh and beautiful in the morning light. "Now I think Thomas would want me to live. Really live. Not just survive. And Mary, I think she'd want the same for you." Matthew covered her hand with his. "It doesn't have to be fast. We can take our time. Do this right. But Sarah, I'd like to court you properly. Take you to Sunday dinners, barn dances when my ribs heal. Show this town that you're not a victim to be pitied, but a woman to be cherished." "I'd like that," she whispered. Elena appeared with coffee and knowing smiles. "About time. You two— the whole town's been taking bets on when you'd figure it out." As the morning wore on, the defenders departed one by one, each promising to return if needed. The Carson ranch settled back into quiet, but it was a different quiet than before. Not isolation, but peace hard-won. Sarah tended Matthew's wounds with gentle hands, and they talked of the future, of expanding the ranch, of the school she still hoped to start, of the life they could build together on the ashes of their losses. The desert wind blew soft and warm, carrying away the last acrid smell of gunpowder. Where violence had bloomed in the night, hope grew with the day. The cycle of revenge was broken. The past lay to rest with the brothers who'd tried to chain her to it. Sarah McKenna had found her strength. Matthew Carson had found his purpose. And together, they'd found something worth fighting for, and worth living for. 6 months had passed since the night of the final confrontation. The Carson ranch had transformed from a struggling homestead into a thriving operation. The barn bore a new coat of paint. The fences stood straight and strong, and a vegetable garden flourished beside the house where Sarah tended rows of corn, beans, and squash. On this crisp October morning, Sarah stood before the mirror in her room, adjusting the ivory dress Elena had helped her make. It was simple but elegant, adorned with delicate lace that misses. Henderson had special ordered from San Francisco as a wedding gift. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from joy. "You look beautiful," Elena said, pinning the last of the wildflowers into Sarah's hair. "Thomas would be happy for you." "I know," Sarah replied softly. "I dream of him sometimes. He's always smiling, always at peace. I think he sent Matthew to me." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Ladies, the Reverend's waiting." Doc Hartwell called. He would be giving Sarah away, having become like a father to her in recent months. The wedding was held at the ranch, under a bower of cottonwood branches that Ben Palmer had constructed with the same care he brought to his metalwork. Half the town had come, eager to celebrate something joyful after the darkness of the previous year. Matthew waited at the makeshift altar, his Sunday best unable to hide the rancher he was, sun-weathered, work-hardened, but with eyes soft as he watched Sarah approach. Beside him stood Tom Rodriguez as best man, beaming with pride. Judge Thornton had returned to officiate, having taken special interest in their story. "It's not often I see justice lead to such happiness." He'd told them, "I wouldn't miss this for the world." As Sarah took Matthew's hands, she thought of all the paths that had led to this moment, the sorrow, The degradation, the violence, but also the courage, the compassion, the unexpected grace of human kindness when it mattered most. "Sarah McKenna," Judge Thornton began, "do you take this man of your own free will, with no coercion or obligation, but purely from the choice of your heart?" The emphasis on choice, on freedom, was deliberate. Everyone present understood the significance. "I do," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Of my own free will, with my whole heart." The vows they exchanged were simple but profound, speaking of partnership in hardship and joy, of building something lasting in a harsh land, of choosing each other not from desperation but from love tested by fire. When Judge Thornton pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard all the way in Cedar Ridge. Matthew kissed his bride tenderly, mindful of the crowd but unable to hide his joy. The celebration that followed was like nothing the ranch had seen. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by the townspeople. Ben Palmer had forged a special horseshoe with their initials intertwined. Reverend Morrison, now fully embracing his role as more than just a Sunday Christian, led the blessing with genuine warmth. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah found herself standing apart for a moment, taking it all in. Deputy Webb approached, looking somewhat sheepish. "Mrs. Carson," he said, the new name sounding strange, but right. "I wanted to give you this. Found it when we were clearing out the McKenna brothers' things." He handed her a small leather journal. Opening it, she gasped. It was Thomas's handwriting, his thoughts, his dreams, pages she'd never known existed. "Thought you should have it," Webb said simply, then walked away. Sarah flipped through the pages, tears blurring her vision. Near the end, she found an entry that made her heart stop. "If something happens to me, I pray Sarah find someone who'll see her strength, her beauty, her incredible spirit. Someone who'll protect her but also respect her. Someone who'll help her become everything she's capable of being. She deserves nothing less than complete devotion, the kind of love that builds kingdoms in the desert." "Sarah," Matthew's voice came softly. He'd noticed her absence and came looking. She showed him the passage, watched his eyes mist. "He knew you," Matthew said quietly. "Maybe not by name, but he knew the kind of man you needed." "The kind of man I chose," Sarah corrected, leaning into his embrace. As the party continued around them, they stood together watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The journey from that terrible night when she'd stood on an auction platform to this moment of joy seemed impossible. Yet here they were. "No regrets?" Matthew asked. "How could I regret the path that led me to you?" Sarah replied. "The darkness made me appreciate the light. The cruelty taught me to recognize true kindness. And finding my own strength, that's something no one can ever take away." Elena called them back to the celebration where Doc Hartwell was regaling the crowd with the story of the night Matthew Carson stood up in the saloon and said 5 words that changed everything. "It ends tonight." And it did end, the doctor said, raising his glass. But something else began, something that proves that even in the hardest ground, love can take root and bloom. The toast that followed echoed across the desert. Inside the house, on the mantel, sat 2 photographs, one of Thomas, one of Mary, watching over the celebration with what Sarah could only imagine were smiles of approval. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, each offered congratulations and promises of support. The Women's Aid Society Elena had helped establish was thriving. The school Sarah dreamed of would open next spring, with donations already coming in. The town itself had been changed by the events of that terrible week and the courage that followed. "We've all learned something," Reverend Morrison said as he prepared to leave. "That looking the other way in the face of evil makes us complicit. That one person standing up can inspire others, and that redemption is possible, even in the darkest circumstances." Later, as the last wagon rolled away and the ranch settled into peaceful quiet, Sarah and Matthew sat on their porch, the same porch where they'd kept watch, where they'd slowly learned to trust, where they'd found in each other a second chance at happiness. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, his arm around her shoulders. that Mary and Thomas would be friends. Sarah said that they'd be happy we found each other, and that this ranch, this life we're building, it honors them both. To the past that shaped us, Matthews said, raising an imaginary glass, and the future we'll create. Sarah finished. As they rose to go inside their home, truly their home now, Sarah paused at the threshold. The woman who'd been broken and sold, who'd thought her life was over, was gone. In her place stood Sarah Carson, rancher's wife by choice, teacher-to-be, survivor, and thriver. The desert wind sang its ancient song through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Life in the territory would never be easy. There would be droughts and floods, hardships and losses, but there would also be love, community, and the unshakable knowledge that even in the darkest night, dawn eventually comes. Sarah took her husband's hand and stepped inside, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. She had been tested by fire and emerged not just unbroken, but transformed. And in the end, that transformation, from victim to victor, from property to partner, was the greatest triumph of all. The lamp in the window cast a warm glow across the desert, a beacon of hope in the vast darkness. The Carson Ranch stood strong against the night, shelter and symbol both, proof that sometimes the human spirit can endure the unendurable and still choose love. In the journal Thomas had left behind, his final entry read, "I believe in Sarah's strength, even if she doesn't yet. Someday, she'll show this whole territory what one determined woman can do." As Sarah blew out the lamp and joined her husband, that prophecy had already come true, and the story of the woman who refused to be broken, who found love in the ashes of loss, would be told around campfires and in parlors for generations to come, because some stories, stories of courage, justice, and triumphant love, never truly end. They live on in the hearts of all who hear them, reminding us that even in our darkest hours, we have the power to say, "It ends tonight," and to mean it. Thank you, dear listeners, for joining me on this journey through the harsh yet beautiful landscape of the American West. I hope Sarah and Matthew's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I love connecting with audiences around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of courage, romance, and redemption from the frontier. Share your thoughts below. What part of the story moved you most? Your engagement helps these important historical narratives reach more people. Until next time, partners.